Welcome to something I am very excited to be a part of. It is the Steranko panel during SpyCon. We're going to talk about Steranko's, Jim Steranko, that is, his time on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is something that is very dear to me as well as to my guests today. I will introduce them and then I will let them tell you a little bit about themselves. I will start with Mr. Ted Haycraft. Ted, take it away.
Well, I'm the senior citizen of this group, and I was actually buying these S.H.I.E.L.D. stories as they came off the rack, starting with 153. I was 8 years old, and
So it would be Strange Tales you're referring to, right?
Yeah, Strange Tales 153, and I think Santa Claus brought it to me. There was a spread of comic books on the floor Christmas morning, and I think 153 was there. And it was interesting too because looking back, I saw it's the last issue he did layouts over Kirby. I guess we'll talk a little bit about that later here.
Certainly.
But yeah, I'm an old school collector, but I stay up current with everything. I try to stay fresh. I work at a TV station and I review the TV station's movie reviewer, and I have a Facebook page called Cinema Chat with Ted Haycraft. I'll archive the reviews and I post other things there. And I live in Evansville, Indiana, and it's an NBC affiliate. And I used to work in retail. I was ordering comic books in the store when Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns came out, so that was a big deal, a big time, and an exciting time.
1986, a big year for comics for sure.
So that's a little bit about the stuff. But this series, it was just a game changer and a mind blower for me, and we'll go into that as we go along.
Very good. And we're also joined by my friend Benjamin Granoff. Ben, so good to see you.
Hey Rocco, hey SpyCon, nice to see you. Thanks for having me here.
Very good.
What you want to know about me? I'm a cartoonist.
You're willing to share, Agent 25.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm a cartoonist and educator. Draw comics, storyboards, illustration, you name it. And I teach storyboarding at the New York Film Academy here in New York City. And I've been a fan of Steranko's work for, I don't know, 20, 15 years thereabouts. A mentor who was showing me the ropes of the animation industry, like turned me on to those Baxter paper reprints of the S.H.I.E.L.D. run and the Cap run. And I was already like a big Will Eisner devotee and a Frank Miller guy. And it sort of seemed to merge the two together in terms of craft and innovation. And those are the things that really turned me on about comics. And I think that, like, for me, one thing that you're going to find in this conversation is that I love to look at the pictures. I love to read the pictures. The text, not so much all the time, but I don't know if that's really what it's about. So I can't wait to talk about Pulp, Steranko, and what happens when the legend becomes fact.
Very apt. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that over your shoulder there is the spread from Chandler, which was a work that Steranko did after he left Marvel.
Yeah, man. One thing that I really love about the S.H.I.E.L.D. run is that you can see like the fuse being lit, and then every project, though there aren't a ton of them, or at least a ton that have been released for public consumption, kind of gets like better and better and better and better. And you can see him evolving not only in terms of draftsmanship and craft, but also storytelling and ideas. Rocco, can you introduce yourself? Tell the people what they want to know.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. My name is Rocco Jerome. I am a writer. I like to say that I am equally nostalgic for my own childhood as I am for the childhood of guys that are about Ted's age. And as a result of that, Steranko's work has spoke to me very much as a fan of spy fiction, the visuals of the 1960s, op art, as well as pop art by my own sort of definition of what that is. And I have to say that Steranko, in addition to being a hero of mine for many years, his work is something I look at every day. I have it here in my home in a lot of places, and I think about it a lot. So I'm very very thankful to the folks at SpyCon for letting me have this panel. And I'm very glad to have both of you guys with me because I know that we can talk about this stuff and have some interesting things to say, I would imagine.
Well, I'm honored that you invited me, and obviously we shouldn't yield. We should talk S.H.I.E.L.D.
We should indeed. And Ben was wise enough to go ahead and create some audio visuals for us. I was just going to talk about this stuff, but it sure is better to be able to show it to the viewers, even if they are intimately familiar with these pages. Very, very good idea.
They say 1,000 words for sure.
Yeah, they truly do. And, you know, as you were saying, Ben, they really visually tell a story beyond what the sort of the text will lead into. Whenever I am sort of trying to turn somebody onto this work, I usually tell them to not even read the text as much as just look at the pictures and figure it out for themselves. Maybe even get a little altered before they take a look, see what that does. I've certainly spent a lot more time looking at these images than I have sort of reading them. And I feel like the stories have almost come to me through sort of a certain level of osmosis. This is from, this particular image is from pretty late in the run. I think this may have been that final issue that he did of S.H.I.E.L.D., isn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
Whatever happened to Scorpio.
Issue 5.
And one of the questions, I've been lucky enough to be able to ask Mr. Steranko a lot of questions, especially thanks to the magic of Twitter, where he holds court every Sunday night. And the last time that I asked him a question in person, I simply asked him, who is Scorpio? And what I was getting at there was, I'm very curious as to who Scorpio was supposed to be, because they never really filled that in. And after he left, they made it, I don't know, Fury's brother or something, or like a clone of Fury or something like that. And I'm sure that's not what Steranko was getting at. But when I asked him that, he said, "Your Uncle Ned." So I guess he's not ready to divulge that information. Or I always kind of wonder if there is an explanation, if there ever was going to be an explanation of who exactly Scorpio is or was.
Well, I think that the fold of him being his brother or whatever, kind of, you know, it's not too much of a leap to think that it's kind of like a Jim Starlin, Warlock, Magus kind of situation. Steranko is born on the 5th of November, and so perhaps Scorpio represents his shadow self and kinkiest side.
Very much so.
Here's one of my. You were going to say about the text. I thought it was interesting what both of you guys mentioned. Going through this, before doing this here in the panel, I had noticed there's a couple of times where I always thought he kind of had a cheat, where Nick would be in this total unbelievable cliffhanger, and then the next issue, it's resolved off panel, off story. Yeah. It's like if you didn't want to bother with it.
Particularly true in the first issue of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., where he's about to fall off and die from some sort of a missile. And then in the very next page, he's crashing through a wall on his motorcycle.
Right. Well, here, that panel we just saw, and then right here, he's in this trap, right? And the next issue.
Pay no attention to my desktop. It's disgusting.
And the next issue, he's still in that little contraption, but he got out of it, and it's just like an afterthought. It's just it's as if Jim didn't really want to mess drawing going into the detail on that. You know?
This was why so many people were able to win no prizes back then. It was sort of standard practice at Marvel. It also sort of speaks to a time when people weren't quite as fascinated with explanations in comics, I guess. Like you were just sort of meant to just keep reading, like don't sweat it. Don't worry about why it doesn't quite jibe.
And you get a whole month between issues, with the wait.
Yeah. So hopefully by the time you get there, you're good. This one is one that's always interesting to me because in recent years, Steranko has sort of had, I kind of feel like it's as much sort of a joke as anything, and sort of just a thing where he's playing around, as is often the case with him. But he has said sort of things about Will Eisner that could sort of be taken as a little bit of a diss. He said that Will Eisner didn't create comic books. He created comics for newspapers.
Well, speaking of Will Eisner, that image right there, that was
exactly that's what I was getting at. He's said that Eisner is not much of an influence on him, but if you see that lower corner,
yeah,
that's a very Eisner looking kind of a thing. And he sort of has this thing about how Eisner sort of lay claim or is said to have created the phrase graphic novel, whereas Chandler was sort of a more literal graphic novel. It's actually a novel with photos or pictures rather, not photos, but images. And I've always thought that was very funny that his work clearly shows Eisner influences.
No, I was reading. I bought the Warren Spirits as they came out on the rack, and I'm reading through them, and all of a sudden I came to that panel with this Chinese man under spotlight, and I'm like, wait, what? Wait, and it kind of like, wait a minute. And then I figured out, oh wait a minute, this is Nick Steranko totally lifted it from Eisner, and I was like, wow.
Yeah. There's really no two ways about that. It's pretty funny. So many of these. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the book is called Art de Noir. It's like a career retrospective that I think Vanguard put out.
Yeah.
It does mention that between the publisher and the subject, that a holy trinity of Winsor McKay, Will Eisner, and Jim Steranko has been considered. I don't know. I think that Eisner is interesting. He's certainly more prolific. He did more comics work for public consumption. Steranko's career as a designer and publisher is something that I'm sure that we'll get into. But whether we're talking about the definitions of graphic novels or pamphlets or newspaper comics, it's all words and pictures. It's all, as far as I'm concerned, it's all comics. It doesn't matter what the format is.
You don't really name the baby while you're making the baby, do you? Right? Like it's sort of up to other people to determine what these things are supposed to be called, I think. I really think that Steranko is probably just kidding about that. It's like a lot of things with him. I think it's really just theater for the public. Ben and I became friends as a result of the sort of the fan base that surrounds the comics kayfabe guys at Piscor and Jim Rugg. And, a lot of their, the terminology that they use for their show is based around professional wrestling, backstage lingo, heels and faces, and the maintaining kayfabe, which is when wrestlers, they sort of have their identity for the public. And they do shoot interviews, which is when a wrestler will drop their character and talk as an actual person to an interviewer or otherwise. And I think that Steranko is on the short list of those types of guys, comic creating guys, for whom it really could be said that there is a work and a shoot with him. And I don't really know of him ever doing a shoot. After speaking to him in person, getting to know him a little bit through various venues, he never really stops being that guy, and I love him for it. I think that's great. I really enjoy his approach to life and his sort of the caricature that surrounds him.
Yeah, he's an endlessly fascinating American original, that's for sure.
Yeah,
and,
there's really others to it. Yeah.
When I think about other figures who have in the past fascinated me similarly, I don't know, L. Ron Hubbard, H.P. Lovecraft, Harlan Ellison, Donald Trump.
Right. Yeah.
People who live the legend.
Yeah, that's definitely true. He still lives in Reading, Pennsylvania, where he's lived his whole life. He lives in the same house that he's lived in for some 40 years now, 40, 50 years now. And he is definitely a caricature, or a character rather, of his own creation, which one should always bear in mind whenever he sort of gives his accounting of history, because I don't know how much of it is literally true. Ted, I remember that one of our mutual friends, after we saw him speak in Lexington, I think, pointed out some of the things in his origin story that he told that just simply couldn't be true, especially as pertains to Stan Lee saying, "Pick one."
Right. I was going to bring that up.
And he was going to bump Kirby off Thor so that he could give it to this new kid. Probably not true. And I said, "But doesn't it feel true?" Who does it hurt if it's not true? Like, what's really to be harmed by telling this story? He's an entertaining person, and he sort of has that thing that I once heard Bill Clinton describe as having this thing where whenever he was speaking to somebody when he was on the campaign trail, that person felt like he was literally the only person in the room with him. And Steranko is like that too. You can wait in the line to talk to him for 2 hours, and you can have a line behind you that's as long as whatever the venue is, and you don't really feel like they're there anymore, because he wants to talk to you about who was the greatest rockabilly guitarist, or what did you think of this such an episode of The Twilight Zone, or this movie. Like, it's like he always he enjoys talking to his as he says, his henchmen. I've never really liked being called a henchman, so I don't really go over that. But it's always fun to talk to him, and if you have the opportunity to do so, I certainly recommend it. Let's talk about some of these images.
Yeah, for sure. I just have to continuously refresh the.
Yeah,
I think he likes to see Nick without clothes. There's a couple images in the run where he's totally being, examined. All his uniform and clothes and everything is off. I always thought that as a kid. I was like, ooh, because you never saw superheroes without their uniforms on or their costumes.
Yeah. Well, and like the costume, if you want to call it that you see Nick Fury wearing there, he referred to as a zip suit. He said that it was inspired by his motorcycle leathers. And before that, Fury was seen wearing suits. The suit certainly got a lot more fashionable. There's the iconic shot that's been on countless. It was on the 7-Up cup of the Slurpee cup in the 70s, and you see that all over the place. That was sort of designed to be like what he would put on when he was on a mission. And since then, Marvel just has him wearing this outfit all the time. Plus the stubble. They returned him to the stubble. Steranko very deliberately had him shave on panel, and then kept him clean.
That's an interesting. That's a point. It's an interesting point when Steranko he transformed him. A comic book writer that I know, Chuck Dixon, I think came up with this term "slob hero," and he was kind of he was still talking in his Sergeant Fury mannerisms when he first started, and he had this, and he also had the suit and tie of the Kirby Stan Lee era of what a spy is, and a fedora. And then the 3 issues are inked by John Severin, which are wonderful. I don't know why Severin left it. I'd be curious. And then just as a side note, Severin ends up over on Sergeant Fury years later for a long run doing Sergeant Fury. But the slob hero aspect, and I remember it's almost like he's almost 2 characters. And now it seems like everybody after Steranko can't resolve. Does he talk like Sergeant Fury, has a stubble and a cigar, or is he cool and slick like Steranko made him? And it's really a strange combo you get all the time. Even, do you remember that issue of Captain America where Alan Weiss had him wearing a fur vest? And, so you just, it's always been an interesting thing where Jim said, I'm going to take this guy and modern, but getting to the zip suit, Rocco, do you think there's a little bit of an Emma Peel Avengers influence here, because the leather seems to be a new thing for secret agents? I'm thinking the Avengers might be the first time we saw some of that, that kind of style. Do you think maybe Jim took a little bit from that? Maybe
it could be. I mean, it's also very super heroic, but then a lot of the things that the dearly departed Diana Rigg wore on that show really did sort of look like superhero outfits. Part of that was just the era, of what you could get away with in the 60s.
And you can see all the, the pouches of the early 1990s.
Yeah, yeah, he
tossed
definitely
in
was
there.
early to the pouch. The thing about that too is that Fury, he actually has a legitimate reason to have all those pouches, you know? Like he actually has gadgets in his, whereas we never found out what Cable was holding in his various pouches. But with Fury, we can at least assume that they serve some purpose.
Ted, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Was when Strange Tales was coming out, it seems like Steranko works across maybe a dozen issues of Strange Tales, which is an anthology book that the character at the time shared with Doctor Strange. Was the Howling Commandos also coming out at the same time, or was it in reprints by that time?
No, they were no, it was issue 20. You were up to issue 20 when the first Strange Tales of Nick Fury came out.
Oh wow!
So it was concurrent, and I was actually asking somebody the other day, when did we ever have two comic books devoted to two characters in different time periods? And the only thing we could come up with, he came up with Superman, Superboy. But other than that, this is kind of another interesting, cool thing, because like people were writing into Stan and saying, "Where's Nick Fury now? Where's Nick Fury now?" So Stan threw him in an issue of Fantastic Four. He didn't have the eye patch yet, and he was working for the CIA. And they fought the hate monger for the first time. It was supposed to be Hitler. And then the next thing we know, he has an eye patch, and Tony Stark's recruiting him for the S.H.I.E.L.D. in the Strange Tales 135.
That's funny that you asked that question about two different time periods. The Marvel approach to this with Fury is so much more zeitgeisty than just having one set of stories that takes place in Smallville and the other in Metropolis. It sort of makes you think that with Fury being rooted in the premier historical conflict of the 20th century and in this experimental late 1960s, that he is sort of the heart of the Marvel universe in a lot of ways. He's the guy that grounds it in history and psychedelia and the moment. Well, he's a badass. He doesn't have any problems though. Like his problem is his temper,
Well, part of his problem is that he's a mortal man, right? Like he doesn't have superpowers. Like there's actually a page during Steranko's run where he's like, "I'm getting older. I didn't used to feel this as much." Mm-hmm. And I feel like they really sort of they did great harm to the character when they introduced the Infinity formula, so that he's now over 100 years old and he doesn't age.
Yeah, but they had to do that because it was impossible.
Otherwise,
there's an issue of Sergeant Fury where Reed Richards meets Nick on the battlefield.
Yes. Yeah.
And then Benjamin Grimm as a thing. He's over in Captain Savage and his Leatherneck Raiders as a pilot showing up the Pacific action. And so yeah, it's the whole time, the illusion of time, but they got it. But with Nick and Steve Rogers, you got to do something about it.
Yeah. The illusion of change, right? As,
yes. That Marvel tries to keep. Oh, they have the Fantastic Four have 2 kids, but they're now maybe I think they're getting older, little kids. But Reed's not a World War II veteran anymore.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. This is a great page. This, of course, gets into Steranko's fascination with escape artistry. You notice that Fury probably has a few more strapping him down than most artists probably would draw him with, if they weren't cognizant of making sure that from a theatrical level, like it would look like it would be very hard to escape from this. This is a very ambitious
straps that work.
Yeah,
and that's where I was telling you. The next issue, he's out of it. Even though it doesn't even detail how he got out of it. Really, he's out.
He found a way. Just get over it, kid. You'll be fine.
And how about all this Wally? How about all this Wally Wood influenced machinery behind him? It's all.
Yeah, that's very Woodsian. And also, there's his use of. I don't really quite know if you would call that zipatone, but the way that the sort of the thing around his head, that also reminds me of Wood a bit.
Yeah, but there's a lot of creative uses of screen tone and zipatone in here. And, because it's all analog, it really speaks to the challenge of this stuff and Steranko's skill as a designer, not just as a writer and cartoonist and ink slinger, but someone who is a print production jack of all trades,
Yeah.
and Renaissance man beyond publishing.
Right. Well, and one of the aspects of that too is that he was, I mean, I've never been able to find any absolute proof of this, but he was said to be working in advertising at the time.
Right.
And comics was not his source of income. So the way that, say, a Jack Kirby or a Steve Ditko would bring a page to Stan, if Stan had some problem with it, Stan or Saul Brodsky or one of the guys in editorial, and they said, I don't know about this. This is kind of a weird page. You better redraw it if you want us to pay you for it. Steranko could say, I'll throw you out the window if you don't pay me for this.
Well,
I'm not changing it. I'm not doing anything different to it. And if you fiddle with it, what I'll do next time is turn it in right at the deadline so you don't have the opportunity to fuss with my work. And he had the cojones as well as the secure livelihood to be able to do that and get away with it, which is part of why these pages are as good as they are, I think, and it's groundbreaking.
Two things, well, referencing that, the Saul giving him some crap about paying, that was specifically referencing the silent sequence in issue number 1 of Nick Fury.
Yeah, which is in here. We'll get to that for sure.
You know, there's no script. And he goes, we're not going to pay you. I mean, well, why should, and then Jim, put his foot down and said, yeah, they go all 3 out the window. Another thing about the seeing Stan and that whole mythological story about pick whatever, which, is really interesting. But he said that he got Flo. He said, I don't have an appointment, but he'll see me, and he did. But Roy Thomas, I was looking at the Masterwork intro and the Masterworks of Roy, who always has a really great, as opposed to Stan, has the opposite, has a great memory. He said he saw some of the pages that that Jim brought in, and he says, I think we should look at them. I think, I think so. Part of it, I think Roy helped say, convince Stan. At the end of the day, let's take a look at this guy.
Yeah. I mean, he really knows, because I mean, the story as he tells it was like that he did it all in one day. He went to Harvey, went to DC.
So did cartoon. I don't want to.
Joe Simon tried to tell him that he needed to draw his women looking like Betty or Veronica, and Steranko grabbed his hand and squeezed it. Like all these stories that he tells. Yeah. To me, it's something like your grandpa would say, and you love him, so you're like, okay, I don't know.
Bob Dylan.
But I want to believe it. I want to believe these stories are true.
Yeah. Well, when Bob Dylan showed up in New York, that's what he was doing. He was telling all these stories about how he was in carnivals in South Dakota and, doing all this stuff until some Newsweek reporter outed him on it. But
I don't want to know the truth if that's not the truth. Yeah. The great thing about this sequence, too, is that it gave birth to so much sense. Thanks in no small part to Larry Hama, who made a few issues of G.I. Joe that had a whole issue without a single caption or a word balloon or any sort of narration on the page.
Yeah, Larry did the intro to one of the trades, and he flat out says that,
Yes, very much so, very much so. Another thing about this page is that it takes its time, which was very uncommon for comics at that time. A lot of people who are enthusiasts of current books are very used to decompressed storytelling, which has now sort of been the norm for almost 2 decades now. Whereas back then, to do something like this and have a sequence of events play out like this with such a deliberate path and really taking its time was very unusual at that time. You can see why the guys in editorial would look at this and sort of be a little bit puzzled. One of the things, too, that Steranko has talked about a few times is that he was very fond of drawing the moment before impact, whereas Kirby and other artists, Kirby especially was the one that he referenced in this, would draw the moment of impact, whereas Steranko a lot of times you would sort of be wondering what was about to happen more times than not in his work.
Well, who was a master of that, too, in film was Sergio Leone. It's all about the buildup and not the actual climax.
Yes, definitely an influence of Steranko's, and a lot of theatrical influences for him as well. He's a movie buff for sure.
And when I
Ben
think
Reed
about that
says-
conflict between editorial and creative in terms of innovative and silent storytelling, I think a lot about Paul Galassi and Gene Day on Shang-Chi,
Oh yeah, I
where
wonder.
there's tons of innovation, and Jim Shooter is like, nah, dude, you gotta have 6-panel grids or the kids won't get it and they won't be into it. It's like, no, man, like I want to work at it. I want to have a puzzle,
Yeah.
and I want to see that you really thought about what you're giving me.
Yeah. Yeah, Galassi and Gene Day both, but Galassi especially, I think, are definitely from the Steranko school. Steranko once even said, he said this during the 70s when Galassi was on Master of Kung Fu. Somebody asked him what he would be doing in comics if he was still working at Marvel at that time, and he said, just take a look at what Galassi is doing. I would
That's
probably
cool.
be doing that, which,
Well,
I'd imagine that had to have made Galassi's day when he heard that.
Well, I'm so glad you brought him up because I wanted to mention, in fact, I forgot to look something up before we started this because I was buying Shang-Chi monthly when it started. And of course, it was Jim Starlin at first. And I looked, it was nice Starlin artwork. And then Galassi comes on and goes, this guy's channeling Steranko, but it's a little bit crude, a little bit early. He hadn't worked all his kinks out. And then he disappeared from the monthly book for a few issues. And I almost basically dropped the book because he was no longer Galassi there. And I think Galassi was doing he was in the Black and White magazine or doing the Jungle Guys or something. But then he comes back. And when he came back, it was under a Gil Kane cover. I wish I knew what issue. It was Razor Fist, I think, fighting.
The one where does he fight the cat in that issue?
No, that's another story arc down the road. But he comes back. I just, randomly picked up the Shang-Chi because I had almost pretty much stopped buying it because it was a round table of artists. And it's one of those just, new Gil Kane covers. I love Gil, but there were so many Gil Kane covers, you just kind of became immune to them.
Yeah, they didn't like Galassi do the covers of those very often,
Right.
which
He probably didn't have time.
really resent that, honestly. Because the first page that he would always draw would almost be,
Right.
it would be like a cover in and of itself.
So I opened up the
To the
page.
degree where a lot of my Shang-Chi's, I'm tempted to just tear the covers off, although that would be obviously a foolish move.
Exactly. So I open up the page and there's that movie poster. It's like a movie poster for a James Bond film. And all of a sudden they're in full Steranko James Bond movie mode. They even bring in a character called Clive Reston who looks like Sean Connery.
Who is the son of James Bond and the grandson of Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Not that I'm saying it. Let's not get too far down this path.
But I just wanted to say that it was just so, it was the modern, at that time for me, it was like, it kept me going because it was the new Steranko, what he was doing with time and panel and pacing and graphics. And it was in the spy mode. And it was in the spy mode. So yeah, it's almost like a follow-up to this run.
One of the greatest comics runs ever. This page is very important to me. I actually have a blown up version of this hanging on my wall. The first contact.
The original version or this corrected version?
I have this. I actually prefer this printed version, honestly, because I think that the subterfuge of it. I mean, the gun in the holster is obviously very suggestive. I think that in a roundabout way, it worked out better than it could have otherwise.
Tell the story for the normies out there.
Yeah, indeed.
I know you love this story.
Yeah, it's so great. So before Steranko learned that the best thing that he could do would be to turn in his pages as late as possible so that no one could monkey with his work, he did this particular page, which I believe is the Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. #2.
Yes.
Okay. And the original version of this page, the phone was off the hook, as if to imply that Fury had taken the phone off the hook so that he could make out with his girlfriend and not be interrupted. And the final panel had, my cat has got the zoomies. He's running all over the place. And the final panel had an image of Fury and the Contessa here sort of like hugging. Not anything even more suggestive than that. They weren't even kissing at that point, but it was like, it sort of looked like she was like climbing up off the floor as if to engage in some adult activities. And the Comics Code Authority, which we should always remember, we tend to think of the Comics Code Authority as being like some entity. That's not what the case was. The Comics Code was entirely self-censorship. There we go, Ted. Very good. That's the original panel with the phone off the hook. Phone off the hook makes sense. Having the phone on the hook sort of doesn't make sense, but at any rate, they decided to go with a zoom in of the gun in the holster, which of course it's sort of like a dirty joke in and of itself. He stuck the gun in the holster. I'll let you come up with what the rest of that parable would be. And to this day, Steranko says that his big quip about this is that whenever he sees a phone on its hook, he gets a boner, because it's apparently just seeing a phone off a hook is apparently dirty enough to require some sort of censorship. At least it did in 1968.
The one thing that I wish for when I look at this panel is that some of the simpler white background panels were borderless.
Yeah, I never really thought about that, but
You know, it's just like, I just kind of wish that like the lips were just sort of floating there in space.
yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought about that, but yeah, that would be good.
It's one of those things where, you know, all these formal innovations from McKay to Eisner to Steranko to Miller to Scott McCloud, and then all the hundreds and thousands of creators who are professional and amateur alike that push this medium forward. You know, people can bemoan what's going on in terms of sales numbers right now, but there's a generation of little kids that are growing up on super popular graphic novels that are going to become creators in 10 to 15 years, that are going to do things that none of the old heads would ever have thought of.
No.
And comics are never going to be not vital, thanks to creators like this and people that make them.
And you can imagine, I'm a 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, and this is one of my main books I buy off the bat. And I'm like, all of a sudden, I'm just like leapfrogging into what is great comics. I was looking at the what comic books were on sale. I don't think I really got to buying DCs till 1970 when Jack left Marvel and Neil started Green Lantern and Green Arrow in 1970. Marvel had my undivided attention so much because of all this stuff going on, this innovation.
Yeah, which makes sense. I can't imagine if I was around back then, there would be a lot of DC books that would have been very intriguing to me.
No, they were intriguing, but also I only had so much of an allowance in mowing money,
Sure.
and you couldn't.
Yeah.
And back then, before the '68 expansion, you could buy the entire Marvel universe on my allowance because they were only 12 cents, and I could buy There's one month in January '67 I bought every Marvel except for Billy the Model and maybe a cowboy book.
Yeah.
But I bought every single Marvel book of that month.
Makes
Well, you're
sense.
lucky they weren't covered in gold foil embossed chromium.
Yeah, and I didn't
Christ's
slab
sake.
them. I didn't
It really
slab them.
drives the prices up.
You can afford 2 of those a week. You know?
My copies are very well worn, and they're not anywhere near mint or good almost, because I read the things over and over again. This is pre-cable, pre-video games, pre-internet, pre-everything. So what you would do, you would just read these things to death and go over them, you know. And with Steranko and Neil Adams, his contemporaries, you would just be blown away.
Yeah. All of my copies of these comics came to me through, like, I was already nuts about them. I had reprinted versions, but my original issues of Nick Fury and The Strange Tales, it wasn't all of them, but it was most of them, came from a guy who had been a kid at the time, like yourself, Ted, and he had lost interest in comics. And there was a bunch of different key issues, as they call them. I personally hate that phrase, but they had a lot of different books. But the only thing that he seemed to have all of, that he seemed to be devoted enough to keep picking up on a regular basis, were these books, which is very fortunate for me. I'm very glad that that was the case, because it got me started, and I was able to get most of them in one fell swoop right off the bat, and then go back and get the issues that I was missing right before the prices exploded, which was nice. What I was going to say about this particular page, in addition to the fact that I love it dearly, there's 2 things that always kind of come to note for me, and I think this is just a coincidence, but the final panel echoes the final scene in the movie Bullet, the Steve McQueen movie Bullet. The last scene in that movie is a gun in a holster, which I've always thought there might be my own psychosis, always kind of tried to connect those 2 things and imagine that it was somehow related. And then the other thing was that the first communication that I ever had with Mr. Steranko before he started doing a lot of conventions, he was at a show in New Jersey, and my friend Joseph Baronato got to go. So I sent him my copy of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. #2, and I asked him to have this particular page signed. And I asked him to ask Mr. Steranko what was playing on the hi-fi. Because I want to know the soundtrack to the scene, right?
Oh,
As someone for whom music is really important. And I imagine that it was like Sam Cooke. There's a Sam Cooke song called That's Where It's At that literally sort of describes the page. What do you see on the page? Making out with your woman. And Steranko stood up and he pointed at Joe's chest, as I've seen him do and as he's done to me a few times, and said, "No. There's a time for talking and singing, and there's a time for none of that." And this was one of those times.
Great.
The hi-fi is playing Eddie Lockjaw Davis, whom I had never heard of, who was a jazz musician. And jazz had always sort of been Greek to me. Like I wanted to like jazz. People that I knew who liked jazz seemed to have a certain inner peace that I aspired to and could never quite achieve. And Eddie Lockjaw Davis is a saxophonist, jazz guy from the 60s. And I was like, oh, wow, I might not be able to figure this out. So I found some Eddie Lockjaw Davis and I listened to it and I looked at the page. And that was the moment that I sort of figured out, this is like 12 years ago, 14 years ago. I sort of figured out like, oh, well, jazz is sort of like a soundtrack. You don't just put it on and like sit there and wait for the truth of the universe to come to you. It's like you're making dinner with your woman. You're driving in your car. You're talking to somebody really intelligent. Like jazz is sort of more, it's like the incidental music to your life. And that was something that only sort of made sense to me after Steranko had pointed that out about this page.
well,
Music is a huge. Oh, sorry.
no, I was just gonna say that's a very inside detail. That's a very fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and it was challenging. It was one of those things where it was like the answer was not what you want to hear. You know, I mean, he's going to challenge you in all ways. It's just sort of part of what I took from that.
Music is a huge part of Steranko's life and identity and career. And
Very much so.
your name is Rocco after all. So I'm sure that you can give us a little bit of background on the old jazz master himself.
Yeah. Well, he was a rock and roll
all
guy.
that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
We need more Steranko autobio, because to me, like that's the bit that really that's where the endless fascination comes in. It's not in this incredible comic book that he did. You know, he did it monthly, I think, for 15 issues, and sort of moved on to other ideas and pastures. But can you talk a little bit about the rock and roll background, and we can talk about the escape artistry and immigrants and the magic and the criminal ways, the carjackings and all that stuff. That's what turns me on the most.
Ben, you would have loved it. At one Cincinnati convention I saw him. I've seen him several times, and I went to his talk, and he basically spent the entire hour on his motorcycle game and the rock and roll music, and we never even touched comic books.
We didn't get to comics.
Yeah, and if you really, like, for anybody who's watching this who's never met him, like, talk to him about something besides comics, because he'd really like to talk to you about anything else. And he always plays this game with rock and roll where he'll say, who are the 3 best guitarists, like rock and roll guitarists from the rock and roll era of the 1950s. And that's like, when you say 3, it's like, I can tell you who the best one I think is, or the 5 or the 10, but that 3 number becomes really tricky. And we talked at some length about that, about who would make the list and why someone else wouldn't and that sort of thing. But he's a guitarist. He was a purveyor of a genre that he refers to as house rock. I've never heard this music. He also says that he invented go-go girls. He was the first person to have girls dancing on stage.
All right.
When we played rock and roll music, and he also sang. And there's a number of stories from that period. One in which one of his bandmates was a bit of a heel, and he tricked him into sleeping with the girl who had the clap.
Right.
One of the things that he talks about from that period is that there were occasions where his music would either be too fast or too slow for some of the patrons, and they would take up against him. I believe that there was an instance in which he was sort of like trapped in a bathroom and he had to escape through the window, and he used to carry around, hell, he probably still does, a silver dollar that is sharpened down so that it's like a weapon, but it just looks like a silver dollar so that he could take it out on people if he so required. Just an endlessly interesting guy. I don't know that he does this as much anymore, but when he first started taking to Twitter, he would do what he called TNT, which is a Twitter narrative technique,
Right.
which you've seen other people do as well. It's just simply like a sequence of tweets that tell a story. And I mean, I would like frantically like cut and paste those and like form them into narratives and then post them places because I was always afraid that we would lose them one way or the other. But
Yeah,
just
I recall him doing that in the first few weeks of Twitter, and there was, some story from when he was 12 years old about being in Reading, and
Yeah.
I was like, this isn't going anywhere. I'll just, I'll turn this into comics one day, and it's just like buried under 15 years of tweets at this point. So if you've got those, I think that like that would make one of the best bootleg anthologies imaginable. Is people
100%. And I'm glad you
Maybe
said
that'll
that.
be our next project.
Yeah, I'll have to look and see if I still do. He was bullied a lot as a kid, and there was sort of a point where he decided he'd had it and turned it around. He built a machine gun or some sort of like a shotgun and
a zip gun.
zip gun, as he called it.
A single shot zip gun that's
Right,
just
yeah.
as likely to blow up in your hand than in the other guy's face.
Yeah. See, that's part of the thing too that makes his stories have a certain level of credence is that like there's always this sort of like amount of humility that sort of comes across. Like Donald Trump. Like Trump will never admit that he ever even had a single thought that wasn't a genius level thought. But like
unlike Trump.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Like
Steranko is he uses the phrase geek off the street
to
describe himself, but it really endears him to the line of guys who like that's who we are. And he lets us know that he's one of us.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you said that too, because that reminds me of a thing that I always sort of think about. And this was the first thing that I remember that I said to him in person that he said, come back and talk to me later after the line dies down. The first time that I met him in Lexington was that he was part of that sort of first generation of comic creators who were initially fans first. And Roy Thomas is another example of that. Denny O'Neil, who grew up really being into comics. And how that even came up was that I said to him, I was like, it's really a thrill to get to talk to you. I paid the extra $5 or whatever to be one of the first people in line before the show opened. And he stood up and was like, imagine how I feel. I was drawing over Kirby. The first thing they had me do. It's like, how can you not like that guy? Speaking of, do you have any of those images? I know that there's a few in there where he initially.
Oh, yes, I got behind it.
No, that's totally.
It is weird. It was funny when I was a kid, I didn't have the first two, and I was able to find them. And I really loved that first issue with Kirby and Steranko fused together. I would draw that Nick Fury right there, back over and over again. It was a weird, crude, right there. There was something about the simplicity and crudeness and excitement of that. It grabbed me more so than even the later, smoother Steranko.
It's very interesting that they had him doing this first. Well, I mean, they didn't, despite what he said since, they didn't want to just let him just go loose on something. But yeah, I mean, this is, and these pages are fine, but it's to compare these to the ones that were just like an issue or two later. And the interesting thing too was that it's one of those cases in which you could see him getting much better with each issue. You could see that his insight was growing, and that he was, just by virtue of being able to work on these books, that he was developing a set of skills and sort of a confidence to put those skills into action.
But would you agree though that the growth and evolution is almost just like light speed and really quicker than, I'll give you another comparison. I was there when Conan #1 came out.
Right.
And I'd seen, Barry Smith be this really bad Kirby clone, the
Yeah.
first X-Men he did and stuff. It had its own appeal. And he was starting to use Steranko layouts in his fill-ins on Daredevil and Avengers. So he starts on Conan #1. I had to borrow 15 cents from my mom to get it. I had to beg her for it. And I'm there for the whole issue, 24 issue run of Barry Smith. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you want to see an evolution, but you see it gradual from 1 through 24, a much longer evolution, as opposed to Jim's almost like, bang, he's almost there. But
Yeah, it's
issue,
pretty interesting. It really is.
I want to talk a little bit about this issue, this image that's up right here, because this is a Kirby layout, but look at the innovative effect that he puts on it. Like Jack Kirby didn't do that.
No, there's no way.
So imagine that, imagine pitching that to Stan and Saul,
Yeah.
to do something as outlandish as that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if
In a
Saul
good
had to
way,
do-
I mean.
I wonder if Saul had to do the heavy lifting on that and split it apart, or if Jim did that, or who.
I would imagine that Mr. Steranko did that. I mean, I can't fathom anybody else. And I mean, it looks like he maybe even did that with a razor. I mean,
yeah.
just
Oh yeah.
right.
Cut and paste.
That's
Literally.
definitely this panel. And it's funny because I never really thought about this panel that much before, Ben. I'm glad you've singled this out. Is that like this is sort of like an early kind of like, can I get away with this?
Yeah, well, this is where this is all.
Do this? Are they going to not pay me?
It's the most experimental early. I mean, it's 3 stories in. It's, because what happens is that he gets more and more and more control until he's writing and drawing and inking and coloring the entire strip. But
Which was very unusual. Like
Yeah.
nobody else got that deal.
the training wheels come off really fast. I mean, listen, it's because, like you said, he was otherwise employed in more respectable industries.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, he said that like the money he was making off this was peanuts. I mean, he was
Right.
like, it's insulting what they were paying me.
That's where I
there's
think that's where the fanboy comes in. You were talking about the fans that are in the industry. I'm like, why I mean, I kind of understood Roy and his fandom, but Neil and Steranko, both Neil Adams and Jim Steranko, I'm thinking, these guys could be doing, Neil Adams have been doing a national comic strip, but man, they just want to get in there and mess it up with the comic books. And I was always so fascinated that these two guys, and they both advance the technique in the industry in their own way. And of course, I love how Neil would look at this, and of course he hides in one of his dead man. Hey, a Jim Steranko effect.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Acknowledging Jim.
Yeah. Very good. I'm always a sucker for these pages, as I imagine everyone is, where you get the layout of something.
and
this,
not only that, but it's that it's a facsimile document where it's like you could be holding this in your hands because there's this little folded receipt paper has been paper clipped onto it as well.
That's what's so great about Steranko. He would take it the extra step. He would make it look like a blueprint. It's blue and white. Whereas there had been diagrams done before, the Batcave and other things over the years in comic books, but it was just drawn like a normal cut apart, But no, this is, you're looking at the blueprint, man.
My guess is that this is probably it was a red and black image. It was an inked image that had been colored red, and then they took the negative of it, as opposed to I don't even know how else you would do it in the late 60s.
Yeah. Because that blue wouldn't show up.
Right, because if you want like white lettering on a black field, use white ing, but you're not inking in blue ink and with white lettering over it.
Yeah, definitely not. Definitely.
But this is also very Will Eisner. The thing is, Eisner would go heavier on the shadows. Like Steranko only puts the shadow on the paper clip, but not on the piece of paper. So,
Right. Yeah, that's very true.
dismissed.
That's very true.
What was he thinking? It's the thing that really blows my mind here again is that these are done on a very tight deadline.
Yeah, extremely tight. And I mean,
Right?
back then, now a comic just comes out when it comes out.
Right.
Back then, the comic didn't come out because it was ready. It came up because 30 days had passed.
Well, we were lucky. I think we were lucky. He was only have to do a half a book, so that
Right.
helped.
Right.
It was when he got to when he got his own book. I think it was almost. I don't know if I could do a full book. I mean, that was, and of course we got to fill an issue with #4 because of that very fact that he was putting so much into it. He could, a full monthly book was just a killer.
I guess where I'm going with this is that, there's so few projects, right? There's Chandler, there's Outland, Captain America, the Superman story. And so, I believe that it takes him a long time to do work, but major comics work, like, it just seems like we're not destined to be seeing it anytime soon, but there's probably, the theater of concepts rolls deep, I'm sure.
Yeah, because he says he's always working. I mean, like, and there's we've seen very little of that.
But on what? And when are we going to see it?
Exactly. Well, and if you look at it, his magazine, Comic Scene, which became
Totally.
Preview scene, and then preview.
Preview was what it ultimately became.
Yeah.
He has a lot of stuff in there. Like you can tell from a lot of the layouts in there that he had his hands in every aspect. And then
we get
of course,
access to the property and then license to do the artwork in his own magazine. So like, who else? He had full Hollywood access for 15 years.
Yeah.
Like this is a major magazine.
Well, he seemed to have given it up when he grew tired of it too.
Yeah.
We saw that was interesting too. And of course he, as he tells it, the Indiana Jones's whip was his idea. He did all that concept art for Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I'm sure paid good money. And then he said that they wanted him to do the storyboards, and he said, "No, I've already done all I want to do with this project."
Hey, getting back to the S.H.I.E.L.D. series, can we talk about spoilers a little bit, or is it?
Oh, sure. I can't imagine.
You should tell me what happens in the story.
Yeah. Well,
I guess I'm still dying to know.
But I'm gonna try to take you back to when I was like 9, 10 years old, and you're getting this on a monthly installment. And when, first of all, this Yellow Claw character shows up, and Jimmy Woo and Yellow Claw's daughter, and we're like, I had no clue who these. I just thought they were just Steranko new characters, and the fact that there's a fanboy aspect that he actually took these Marvel Atlas characters and brought them into the continuity and used them. So that was cool. When I found that out later, I was like, oh my gosh, it's just another, amazing thing. And of course, the big thing that just you could hear the ripples of minds blowing in my neighborhood when we got this copy off the rack, when we found out it was a big chess game that Dr. Doom was doing.
Yes.
Again, to try to wrap your brain around that at the time as a young kid, it was just words are hard. It's hard to articulate to this day. It was just a amazing thing because it's like, oh, Doom was in charge of this. Well, who exactly were they? All robots? Were the Knicks players were flesh, and then the bad guys were all it was just on and on and on and on. And it was just an amazing thing that the twists and turns he would do on you, not just graphically, but sometimes story wise, the plot wise, it was amazing.
There's no telling for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then we haven't mentioned. I always thought, the obvious influences, Eisner, he's like the perfect combination of Kirby, Eisner, and Wood, all combined together into this amazing new look. But how about Bernie Kristine, his effect?
Yeah, I would say that's certainly in there as well. And one of the things too, and this page certainly leads into that, was that he was using influences outside of comics. And in this panel,
you take what I mentioned there, those artists, and then you take in all the outside influences. That's what made it such a landmark.
One of my favorite things in the world, before I even knew what it was called, has been op art. And if you don't mind going back a couple there, Ben.
You want to go back or forward?
Back to where we were just a second ago.
There's a Kirby fight scene.
Right.
Sure.
This one.
There we go.
I was gonna get to the psychedelia for you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, and for sure that's in there too. But that optical art, as it's called, the main purveyor of that at the time was Bridget Riley. And I used to spend hours just like looking at that kind of art. As you see there on my lapel pin, is a
Oh, right.
That'll trip you out.
yeah, I love it. And it's like when I was a kid, I would look at like whenever I would see it in advertising or anything, I loved it. And on the lapels of all of my jackets have different buttons. And it's funny because people will say, why do you always wear that button? And it's actually like 30 different buttons across a bunch of different jackets. But the fact that he was able to take that, which is very sort of trendy and happening at that time, and work it into a comic about a spy, because it sort of has that element of mystery and confusion. When you look at, some people can't stand op art, they look at it and it automatically triggers a headache. But to me, it's like one of my favorite things. And it's probably the thing that attracted me to Steranko's work first, was that he so sort of seamlessly integrated it into his work. And sort of, go ahead, Ted.
Oh, let me, if I can interject here, this particular two panels, think about how any other artist and writer would have drawn this sequence. It would have been Jasper like holding his head and thinking, oh, I can't, I can't, it would have been broken down into about 3 or 4 panels, and they would tell you in the word balloons or the thought balloons what he was doing. And
Yeah.
Jim does it in 2 panels. You don't even have to read the word balloons. I mean,
No.
the word,
In fact, I recommend that you don't. Well, like, the use of perspective as well is really something. Like, that's not something that you saw very often in comics at the time. Yeah, I mean, he was really just like toying with all of these different ideas. And I sort of, one of the things about it too was that it just sort of seemed like he was doing things that were interesting to him. Like it was sort of like the reader could either catch up or not, was sort of the implication.
Yeah, I mean, it was a toy box. It was an amazing toy box. I was thinking, I'm looking at this stuff before we did this panel. I'm looking, at one point he's got him fighting an octopus, and I'm like,
Yeah.
An octopus? What does an octopus fit into the modern tech high? But it's the pulp origin. He's throwing in pulp elements into it. He's throwing everything in there that he loves. And
He also probably just wanted to draw an octopus.
there you go. So
I mean,
being like trans genre is definitely something that happens in the Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. run, where suddenly we're filming King Kong, and then then we're going to have an issue in a Gothic castle. Then we're going to have the number 6 covers in outer space. And when he leaves, they even Frank Springer, there's that Christmas hate monger cover, and it's always trying something new. I think I would be remiss not to mention Reed Crandall as another artist that Steranko
really,
seems
that's accurate.
to mention a lot. And there's a few others whose names I can't recall because.
would you say early Reed Crandall or late Reed Crandall?
Yeah, I don't know. All I know about Reed Crandall is that he died penniless as the janitor at a Taco Bell or something like that.
Well, I mean, to me, there's like, I was blown away when I went back to Reed Crandall Blackhawks.
Yeah.
It's
great.
It's really amazing stuff. But but I was introduced to Reed Crandall in the Warren magazines, The Creepy and Eerie, where he's kind of stiffed up and he's doing a lot of cross hatching. So,
For sure.
but yeah, I'll have to think about that. I hadn't thought about Reed. That's interesting.
Another thing that was, go ahead, Ben.
I just want, it's too low res. This might be white out over graphic duo shade, or it might be white out over just screen tone. Really, really cool effect. Beautiful high contrast.
Of course, he can utilize the Kirby dots really fantastically.
Yeah.
The Kirby crackle, as it were.
Yeah. There's no holding lines in the upper rights or whatnot.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I always thought when I was a kid, I think one of my biggest favorite books is Fantastic Four, of course, and Senate Kirby. And but it got to a point where I was wanting to read more and more Steranko and Neil Adams stuff. And they were like, I finally figured out Jack Kirby was my grandfather. I loved him. I respected him. Want to spend time with him. But I really wanted to hang out with the cool uncles. And Neil and Jim with the cool uncles.
Yeah,
that's funny.
Sure.
Yeah, when I did a deep dive in 70s Kirby, it was like, my grandfather was born the same year as Kirby, Holocaust refugee, and it was like, I was like, oh, this is like a story that my grandfather would tell me. Like, it sort of makes sense. It's really exciting. It's like very like old world operatic. And someone that you really enjoy is telling it to you, you know?
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, this whole
Use some
blackout
actual
story.
photographs in this page. That's something
Yeah.
that not a lot of creators were doing at that time.
Yeah,
This
I always
might
thought
be,
that-
this might
I
be
was
the duo shed in here.
his use of photos, I think, I hate to say this, I don't want to, Jack was, really loved to do that. And Jack would try that a lot, but I think Jim was a little bit better at utilizing it. I mean,
Yeah, we'll go to that famous collage in a minute. This one looks like it's like a mimeograph, maybe.
Yeah, I
yeah.
would say.
Let's get to that other collage. There's another one with the same effect.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Look at that.
You know, early photocopy technology or whatever.
And of
I
course,
mean, that's pretty wild,
and that works, the way it works is fine, because is it a nightmare? Is it a dream? What exactly is going on in Nick's head,
Yeah.
and, so, of course, that cover in that first page, another, just mind blower. Than that, I also thought it was interesting that Nick got not one, not two, but three not brand X stories. He got parodied 3 times. Well, that must be saying something. I'm not exactly what it's saying, but he got a lot of mileage in not brand X too.
What's this one? Dark Moonrise, Heckhound Hurt or something like
Heckhound
that?
Hurt. Yeah, that's right.
With Snoopy.
Yeah.
This one, this collage sort of has all the things we're talking about, especially that op art effect. And like this is Steranko, I believe. I never saw this little figure on the walker here in color. I don't know what's going on with that. But
if you can get a hold of the recently they made the huge king size version of this.
Is Revolutionary. Steranko
was Revolutionary is the name of the book.
Okay. And that's recent.
It is. Yeah, it just came out just a few months ago. I actually got a copy from Amazon. It came wrapped in a brown paper bag and just thrown in the house.
Oh, God.
It was beat to hell by the time it came to me.
Jeez.
And I promptly returned it and got my money back, but only after I looked through it first. And
but it's colored with like modern reprint paint bucket.
it is.
Right?
It's not as egregious as some of the versions. The most recent colorings of that aren't so bad. They're not quite the original versions. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's sort of one of those things where it's like, it's the same as like, there's one of the versions. The version that you have there, Ted, is from maybe about 20 years ago. Steranko once said,
18 years ago?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Steranko once said that if you were to bring him that magazine, or that book rather, for him to sign, he would spit on the cover of it, and that would be the signature.
But it's worth having a couple reasons. It's got the photo.
I think they're all worth having.
Yeah, they're all exactly because some of the cover galleries are not all full. This one it starts out with the John Buscema issue prior to his start, which kind of story-wise helps it, and it has the 4-page panel, 4-page splash pages fold out.
As a fold out, which is the only book I think that has that.
What page is that folded on? Because I don't think mine has that.
It is the penultimate issue that he did on Strange Tales, whichever number that.
167, I want to say, but
And then Ted, the version you held up just now, that's the more recent version. I understand that you might be able to pick that up at your local Ollie's if you're lucky for about $5.
What?
Yeah. Otherwise, you're gonna have to pay about $30. Pretty good book.
But
It's got all of the Steranko S.H.I.E.L.D stuff all in one place, including covers.
yeah, it doesn't fold out. Yeah, that's right, because this one, I think, doesn't have the.
I found it.
Yeah.
I didn't even know this was in here.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
one
that's the best feature of that book for sure.
This is
The only feature,
If you have this one, you also need the other trade paperback, who is Scorpio, that has the full length one. This is only the Strange Tale stories.
Only the Strange Tales, which is funny because the cover doesn't belie that at all. And then that book that you're holding up there, Ted, is the one that I recommend getting. The coloring isn't so bad in that. The way that I've described this in the past is that having the original issues is like having all of your Beatles records on vinyl. And that trade paperback that you just held up is like having the CD box set that they finally put out.
Now this one,
Coloring in, sorry.
I was gonna say, this one here is got the fold out again, second time.
Yeah, that one I That's the one version I didn't buy because I figured it would. I've
Well,
already
what's
got it.
wonderful, it starts out, it has the FF story with Nick Fury, all the Strange Tales, all the Steranko story, and then the entire S.H.I.E.L.D. run, which has a Barry Smith fill-in, Herb Trimpe drawing him, Frank Springer drawing him, and then it ends up with the Avengers story where they tell you who Scorpio is.
Yeah.
And then,
I don't need any of that personally.
and
Let's,
then-
if you wouldn't mind, Ted, could you find where it folds out and show us that? Because I'm really
Yeah.
curious how that looks.
and then
Because the original pages for that, they were like panels. You know, they were like 4 panels. And of course, what we're referring to here, as Ben says, for the normies, was that Steranko did a, yeah, look at that. Yeah, I'm going to have to get that. Look at that. That looks about like the original thing. You had to buy 2 copies of the comic if you wanted to put them side by side and see that full image.
and
Which is one of those Steranko legends that he turned it in, and Stan said, I can't do anything with this. This isn't right. You can't do this. And Steranko said, but it will make people buy 2 copies. They'll spend another dime so they can fold it out on their mom's coffee table.
and as
If they're a true fan, they'll do that.
and then we're all also waiting for volume 2 of this.
Yeah, which I don't think is going to come out
Yeah. But,
anytime soon.
and I think, Rocco, didn't you that weekend, the same weekend I did, he, what did he do?
I had him sign that. Yeah, when he came to Louisville. I didn't want to travel with that
Yeah,
book.
you should appreciate this, Ben. A giant Steranko autograph, the size of an artist.
Yeah,
Very cool.
yeah, I got one of those too.
Is that book? Is that book good? Are there some weird production issues with some of the resolution?
Nothing I was able to ascertain.
Okay.
It's as close as you'll ever get to being able to hold that original art in your hands, short of breaking into his house in Reading.
Fair enough. I
he's-
wanted to make 2 comments on the coloring of these editions.
Oh yeah,
This
for sure.
This one's weird because it's got a digital modern 2002 recolor.
The only reason that one's still in my collection is because it does have that 4-page spread.
So that's weird. But then this one, the first 3 issues look like it's the colors on Baxter paper.
Yeah.
So it looks like the separations have a lot more fidelity. And it doesn't look, I mean, it looks so much better than any modern paint bucket coloring job.
I agree.
then
It
the
looks like
last-
maybe they were taken from those issues, those
Yeah.
Baxter.
But then the final issue has all the 4-color Ben-Day dots
Yeah.
in it, which is really, really weird. I mean, that's sort of how I wish all these reprints would look, because people talk about recoloring here and there and, oh, you suck out all the atmosphere. But the truth is, it's all already been recolored.
Right.
You know? Anyway, that's my rant.
And there's a fanboy, the anal retina fanboy talking to me. The first 2 were these. You'd had the Strange Tales in here, the 1, 2, 3, and 5.
And at that time, the early 2000s, that was the only way to get those. Like
The problem was the cover gallery. They had the Wally Wood takeoff issue 6, but they
very, very woody.
but they didn't put the Salvador Dali one in there. And I was like,
Right.
it's incomplete. Where's the
That's
Salvador
right.
Dali cover?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. After I had heard Steranko said that, the first time I met him, I believe, was in Cincinnati at the Cincinnati Con. And like I had mentioned before, I paid extra so I could be one of the first people in line. I didn't want to be the first guy in line, so I was like the third. So there was a couple of guys ahead of him so that I could sort of gauge what his vibe was. And the first guy in line had that book, the one that he hates so much. And I was like watching like, okay, this is going to tell me a lot about like what it's actually like to meet Mr. Steranko, because this guy was just holding that book and it was like, what's he going to say? And the guy, he put the book down in front of him and he looked at it. He looked at the guy and he said, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with it? And I'm like, oh no, it's about to go off the rails. And he was like, I want you to promise me that you will buy the original issues if you can find them, or one of the newer printings of this, because they're better. I will sign the inside of this. I'm not going to sign the cover because I don't like what they do with my work. And I appreciate that you brought this. Like, he was pretty gracious about it, but he did sort of like say to the guy, like, do better next time.
I'm sure this is true with you, Rocco, but it seems like every single Steranko encounter I've had, every single one's been unique in one way or another.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I also think that one of the things too, like I don't want to get into this too much, but like I met Neil Adams and it didn't go well. And I like Neil Adams' work a lot, but he's not like a Steranko to me. And at the end of that encounter, I was kind of like, okay, well, kick rocks, Mr. Adams. You know, I mean, like, I was okay with just being like, you're being a jerk. But if you really look up to somebody and you really are like, they're like one of your guys, like you'll sort of give them a lot more leeway than you would somebody else. So like there's a certain measure of that with Mr. Steranko as well. Like I've known people that they came away with a negative impression. They were like, he was kind of a jerk to me. And it's like, to me, it's like he just kind of seems like he's kidding. You know, maybe that's just wishful thinking. I don't know. But
I had an encounter once. You know, I met him at cons a half dozen times as a young man in the New York area, and this was maybe close to 10 years ago. It was a Big Apple Con in Manhattan, and I had it was like my girlfriend at the time. It was her birthday, and we had just gotten. There was like 2 activities for her. Like there was a meal and then something else. And in between there was literally like 20 minutes to go see Jim Steranko. And, she knows all the, I've been talking about this guy and blah, blah, blah. And she doesn't really care. And I think I was like up there talking to him on the second floor. And one of his famous comebacks will be like, he will refer to a hypothetical ugly girlfriend of yours, right? She looks like a 1-year-old girlfriend, you know.
Yeah.
Kind of Perez. And this, I think I was like taking too long, and I think that my girlfriend like got to the gate and she's like, "It's my birthday. My boyfriend is up there, schmoozing with Steranko, and I need to get in there and like get him out of here." And they're like, that'll be $25. She's like, does it sound like I want to be at this convention? She like rides up the escalator. And I'm like, oh, there you are. And, she showed up and she just like gave this guy what for. She just like gave him so much attitude and like rolled her eyes and like sneered and was like, oh, you're Steranko.
Oh my gosh.
And prior to that, there was, oh God, Stan was at this show too. And there was like an innocent 6-year-old child walked up to the table and said, will you sign my comic book, Mr. Stan Lee? And his like face like dropped and he's like,
yeah, you got to see him go a little bit.
But what a character, what a time. What did you call it? The theater of life.
Theater of concepts is what he always talks about.
No, his own kayfabe.
Oh right, yeah, no, it's yeah. I mean, it's like he's
all
got
performance, yeah.
It's a certain level of performance. Like you wonder if when he's at home in Reading, like when he goes to the Walgreens by his house, does he wear the wig? Does he wear a suit? Is he even recognizable? I mean, is this all a persona? You know, I mean, one has to wonder. It seems like a lot of it is just him. Yeah. I think about a very good friend of mine, a guy named Ken Motti. He's probably watching this. Hey, Ken. Once said that being the kind of guy that we are and have the kind of interests that we have, you sort of like assume some expectations in your mid-teens. And then as you get older, they more and more just become who you are. And I think that's definitely true of him.
As you get your revenge on the world.
Yeah, right. As you take out your childhood on the world and then sort of get that out of your system and have successes and victories as you go about the course of your life.
So it's said about comics that for these guys who are superstars that they can visit fame.
Yeah.
You know, so like no one knows who they are, but they go to that show and then he's living legend rock star.
Yeah.
And at $25 a pop. So
yeah. Yeah, the first time that I saw him in person, I was at that convention, and I remember that there was a guy across from me who had an SS tattoo on his arm
Jesus Christ.
at a comic convention. And he was looking at these comics. And as I was looking at them, I was like, Jewish creator, Jewish artist, Jewish person created that character, Jewish person wrote that comic. Like, it was just like, what is this guy's worldview? And like, you know, in those types of situations, you're always kind
Well,
of
he hasn't been reading comics for very long. You know, he doesn't.
Yeah, clearly. But like, it's like there's always that sort of thing where it's like, is something going to happen that's going to make this a bad day? And then I saw Steranko coming up the elevator. It was pretty unmistakable. And it was like, should I say something now? When it's like, no, I'll wait until I get in line and I get the chance. And I think that the thing too, like, is that I've gotten to meet him in flyover states because that's where I live. Like, if I were to have met him for the first few times in New York, I don't know that I would have proved memorable enough for him to continue to communicate with. But it was always just kind of like, you know, anytime I've been able to sort of be around him, he always strikes me as being like pretty patient and just like he's having a ball. I mean, it's hard to fathom that he's not having a great time.
And think about this, is that you go to the, you know, it's hard to explain this to civilians, I guess is why, you know, non-comic book people, that we call them civilians in our circle. And you can't go to a convention and pay $30 and get to hang out with Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese or Francis Coppola.
Exactly.
But here, you get to spend, you get one-on-one attention from these guys that are on the same level in the industry as those guys are. So it's just a weird phenomenon in some ways, but it's always been great because for the most part, I've almost met every one of my heroes over the years, and these guys are just as important to me than a Scorsese or a Peckinpah or a Kubrick, you know.
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, it's like, I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to talk to Steven Spielberg, you know?
Yeah.
I wouldn't. If I saw Brad Pitt, I don't know that I would cross the street to talk to Brad Pitt. But, you know, one time a friend of mine referred to the people at these comic conventions as D-list celebrities. And I wanted to punch him in the face. It's just like, these are the people that are worth talking to. These are the ones that actually make things go around. You know, I mean, without these concepts, without these creators, you don't have anything else. The actors don't have anybody to play, you know.
And look like here, these images right here we're looking at, you know, this is just part of just a small part of the whole series. He really just played with it. And this is late 60s, you know. I mean, that panel down there with Nick's different faces.
Mm-hmm.
That's
a great
sequence.
sequence.
That's fresh and modern today.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that the most intense one is this third to last orange one where he looks like he's going to puke. I want to tell probably my most heartwarming tale of social intelligence from our hero. I mentioned the Geeks Off the Street. So, you know, it was a show where we had lined up for 2 hours, and a gentleman, an old head, did not see the line and just kind of made his way in from the other side. And
I've done that, by the way.
well, that's fine. And to give Steranko his due and to give him his zine and all, you know, whatever it was. And Steranko was more than happy and gracious to handle this guy with the kind of dignity and respect that anyone would deserve, without, and also wrangling the people who had been waiting 2 hours, who it was their turn now to get the FaceTime. So it was like, you know, there's a lot. We didn't even talk about magic and escape artistry and all that, but it was almost like saying a sleight of hand, you know, human wrangling, very gracious kind of story. I enjoyed that.
I mean, speaking of the magic, that's the one thing too. When I was reading as a kid, I had no idea. I had no background on Jim Steranko. Maybe, I guess there's probably background material in the history of comics. I got those pretty early on. And we even talked about
when he did that interview with Rolling Stone in I think 71, like I think that was the first time that.
Okay, so now going through these stories, I see the escape artist in them so much.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's, you know, it's just there's a series. It's just an unbelievable series throughout the entire storylines where he's got Nick in an escape Houdini type situation or whatever, and he's escaping it. And it's very interesting to know that now, going in, looking at it now, that I had no clue that was part of his background.
Yeah, here's that 4-page spread that we were referring to before.
So, yeah, I
There's
never had.
also there's a late, maybe early 60s book called Steranko on S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
It's a close-up magic.
Yeah.
How to
A self-published thing that has since been republished.
Oh, it has? Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's got that like 1950s minimal geometric illustration in it.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a cool book too. I really enjoy owning that. Whenever for anybody watching, getting to meet Steranko at a convention, one of the most fun aspects of it is to see what he has on his table, because he'll sort of just like bring things from his collection and just bring them in, and it's never the same thing. It's always different stuff from these deep boxes in a warehouse, as he calls it. And you really don't know what you're going to find. From one time to the next, you may get some shadow, some of the shadow covers that he did in blown up form, or you might find some of the things from when he was working at Marvel, when he was doing Foom. He's brought some of the posters and the membership kits. I think I got his last full membership kit in my possession, because the one that I got, he said it was his last one, and it was.
Oh wow! Look at all that
It had been sent to someone and was returned to sender. Like whoever got it, it was the wrong address or something. So it's got some poor schlub's address on it, and then the stamp return to sender. That he held on to that one, and he sold it to me for I think like $20. I mean, like.
And was Foom through Super Graphics, his company?
Yeah, I believe that it was.
Unbelievable.
Initially,
Yeah. Yeah. And he always says that Foom, like he did like the first 4 or 7 issues of that. And he said that he kept asking for more resources, and they frankly just weren't giving him any to make it worth his time. And he always said that after he quit, it suddenly became produced by Marvel, and then they had all the resources that he could have used. Yeah, and there's a lot of other people's art in the Foom stuff, but it still has his stamp on it. His design is very, very obvious throughout that it's a Steranko product.
Look at all this stuff here. As a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, and I was reading this. I mean, zip through my Kirby's, my Gene Cullens, my, different things. Who else was working at the time? But I would literally stop, like that panel where the image of the woman's face in the red panel. It would just stop you in your tracks. It would just stop you. You would just come to a complete halt, and you wouldn't go on until you just sat there and looked at it and let it seep into you. Then you might go on and read the rest of the story at some point.
Yeah, I mean, this art, I've spent so much time trying to sort of recreate this art, look at it, think about it. I mean, there's so many, and I think the part of it too is the brevity of it. Like it's like he didn't put out that much, and it's like it feels like all the answers are in there, but it's like there's just so many different panels and tricks and flourishes that he used that I can only imagine that I'll just be looking at this stuff for the rest of my life and just sort of marveling at it. It's to me, it's endlessly interesting.
Yeah, as a bridge between the pulps, the first generation of fandom, what was going on in the late 60s, what was going on in British TV with Pat Magoon and the Avengers and Secret Agent and all that, and Peter Max, the counterculture. Wild.
Yeah, and so much too is the pop art. It's like he was one of the only guys who was working in comics who was sort of like, I'll go ahead and say that he was sort of one of the only ones that was sort of hip enough to be cognizant of what was happening with what they were calling pop art.
Yeah.
And to me, like one of my big missions in life is to sort of take that phrase back. There was a period right before Steranko came around where Stan was calling Marvel Comics Marvel Pop Art Productions. Mm-hmm. And he quit doing it because fans wrote angry letters. And I really wish that he would have stuck to it. There's definitely irony in there that he let it go. But pop art became something that, thanks to Old Roy, was sort of just taking comic book panels and tracing them, recreating them, and sort of looking down at them. I think the pop art is in the actual comics themselves, right? Like, I think the point that like a Warhol was getting at was that there's a beauty in a can of soup, something that was mass produced that everybody recognizes and the feeling that comes with it. I think the real true pop art is in the comics.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I think that the thing that Stan brought for me, and not that I was there, is that sense of belonging, of fun, wink and nod, no prize, like relax, it's not that serious. And that sense of fun has not been present for decades. You know, the line gets reshaped to try to inject it in here and there. But I think that as soon as the numbers are down, they just fall back on events, hyper-realism, boilerplate, whatever.
Not as much.
Yeah,
and also Stan was the first to give credit to the actual artist. He was the first to make sure that the artists had their names in the books. And it's hard to imagine that Steranko has always
he would have done it without that.
Very exactly. Yeah, it's like he was always really into giving Stan credit, because it's hard to fathom that he could have done this under like a Mort Schlesinger.
But Ben, Ben has some good point about how that was. To me, the letter pages and the bullpen page with the checklist and everything, those were just as important to read as the book itself, the story itself. And I felt like I was a part of a group, and we were all in this having fun. But the great thing too was these writers and artists would all of a sudden give you a heartwarming story. They would all of a sudden do this story, you know, with that guy sacrificed in that Fantastic Four, that Ben Grimm story, that lo, this monster, behold that monster. I can't think
this man, this monster.
Yeah. And you would get so a really sense of a depth and emotion, and then go back to the fun stuff and have a good time. I also wanted to point out that we're talking mainly about his S.H.I.E.L.D. run. What I thought also was fascinating about Steranko, and this also applied to Neil Adams, is that it seems to me that they wanted to do every sort of genre before they left. And sure enough, I missed it. It took me a while to find it. I don't know how and when I discovered it. It was he did a love story. Steranko's last thing.
Oh, yeah.
And the only thing he didn't do.
One of my favorite things that he's done is actually that story.
And it
doesn't look like any of his other work.
Right. And he never did a Western story, but he did some Western covers. So and so I'm thinking and just like over in DC, Neil's doing Tomahawk covers. I mean, and they're great looking covers with the insides is in. But so it was always, I thought that was another interesting aspect about it, because like always, you can do Cap, you can do X-Men, you can do Nick Fury, and you can do a love story, you can do a horror story, Tower of Shadows, and he did it,
which is also really good.
Yeah, just amazing, just jack of all trades there. And then of course, the history of comics. That I remember, I have a vivid memory being home in bed, sick in bed, and reading that thing almost the whole day, the volume 1. I just couldn't put it down. And it just gave me such a great crash course. You know, the revelation that, oh, wait a minute, comic strips, pulp magazines, put them together, you got a comic book, you know.
Well, and he was a historian at a time when like that wasn't, like a comic book historian at that time was not something.
No, like the Jules Pfeiffer book was
people were aspiring to be.
Yeah, the only other thing out there was the Jules Pfeiffer book, I think, at the time, and all in color for a dime. But yeah, it was just again, I go, where does he have the time to do all this and figure it all out and play it out?
It's hard to say what he does with his time, honestly. None of this is one of the great mysteries of Steranko. We probably should wrap this up. We've gone for a good long time. Do you guys have any final thoughts before we?
Well, I would just say for the SpyCon, if you're tuning in just because you're a SpyCon fan and you've never seen these stories, you really just need to go seek these out, and you can find inexpensive versions of entire collections and stuff. It's just a fun romp of the zeitgeist at the time, but it holds up today graphically. It's amazing.
I would almost say if you're on a budget, the best thing to do would be to track down those Baxter paper reprints.
Oh yeah,
And I'm glad to hear you refer to those as Baxter paper, Ben, because I always loved Baxter paper, and I barely ever hear anybody talk about it anymore. But they compiled all of the Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. minus the Strange Tale stuff, and I believe 2 Baxter paper reprints in the 80s that not a lot of people are hip to. They look pretty great. I recommend tracking those down if you're on a budget, or if you want to go ahead and get a trade paperback version. That most recent version that I mentioned that you can get at Ollie's if you're lucky is a pretty good way to spend $30.
Yeah, there's also the Captain America Baxter paper editions as well.
Also,
I think the last thing that I want to make mention of and bring up to you guys is Steranko as someone who has a very clear idea of what he wants, and if you don't want to do it, he's not going to do it. That's not really an attitude that lends itself to easy collaboration. And yet, so my quandary is like, playing in a band, that's a lot of collaboration. But then, my guess is that as the band leader, I would presume that he's exerting a lot of control over everything. But then, you got to work with Saul and Stan as the new hotshot, and they take off the training wheels. But then, like, working with Coppola and Spielberg is a whole nother layer and level of control and, freelancing and collaboration and all that. I guess what I'm saying is, the long and short of it for me is, I hope to see a lot more Steranko work at some point. I'm sure it exists. I can't wait to see it. It doesn't need to be polished. It doesn't need to be finished. I just want to see what the archives look like, because I'm sure that they are worthy of the legend that was printed.
Same, yeah. He's got a house in Reading. It's a true mystery what's inside of that place. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. This has been a real pleasure. And for everybody who's watching through SpyCon, I'm glad to be a part. And I hope that you come see us in person when the world looks a little bit more like the world that we recognize.